I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, after a quieter night in the skies, we turn our focus to renewed tank movements on the ground and covert operations at sea, before sitting down with the director of the Oscar-winning 20 Days in Mariupol to discuss his new film, 2,000 Meters to Andriivka.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie.
Strong. Nobody is going to break us. We are strong. We are Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 30th of July, 3 years and 158 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by former tank commander Hamish to Bretton. Later, you'll hear Adélie Pojzman-Pontay interview Mstyslav Chernov. But first, the latest military and political updates of the last 24 hours. I spoke yesterday about that Ukrainian attack on a transport hub in Rostov-on-Don, and I'll start today with a Russian strike hitting a railway station in Pavlohrad in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, where overhead power lines were damaged, leading to a rerouting of trains in the area. Overnight, the enemy once again targeted railway infrastructure, said an official source. Fortunately, there were no injuries among passengers or railway workers, as everyone was promptly evacuated to shelters. This just underscores that while Moscow is most extensively attacking the big cities in those huge bombardments, not exclusively so, infrastructure is also a target for them as well. After another day of heavy civilian casualties yesterday, the aerial attacks were mercifully reduced overnight across the front. They were comparatively low in the past 48 hours too, of course, but as we've seen, the smaller number of drones and missiles does not necessarily equate to lower casualties. The civilian death toll for recent nights has continued to steadily climb since the initial ones reported, as more people are found in the rubble or the wounded pass away from their injuries. It's on the front lines where we've seen more activity. The Ukrainians are continuing to push in Sumy, with sources claiming they've advanced Yernunakivka, though Russian mill bloggers say they have made strikes near Moropilya, Andriivka, Yunikivka and east of Oleksandrivka. Down in Luhansk, according to the ISW, Russian forces continued offensive operations near Kupiansk, but didn't make confirmed advances. It's unconfirmed, but there are reports Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups are advancing near Radkivka and Murove, respectively, but have yet to advance into Kupiansk itself. In Donetsk, Seversk continues to see some of the most intense fighting outside Pokrovsk. We've referenced the rarer sight of tank battles there recently, and Hamish is going to comment on that shortly. Indeed, a Ukrainian brigade operating there has repeated claims of large-scale mechanised and motorised assaults in the area, though with the additional detail that Russians used diversionary assaults, implying they're learning lessons and adapting strategy. To be comprehensive, attacks have been reported north, northeast, east, southeast and south of Seversk, so all but in the western quadrants. Chasiv Yar has also seen activity, with reports of some minor gains for the Russians in the south and centre of the city. In Toretsk, Ukrainian forces recently advanced into northeastern Yablonivka and Russians west of Novospassky. CNN reported yesterday a Ukrainian commander operating near Konstantinivka, northwest of Toretsk, saying new drone teams from Russia are well trained and conducting counter-drone measures, such as flying drones with attached threads designed to entangle the rotors of Ukrainian counterparts. In the critical sector of Pokrovsk, Russia is pushing southeast of Volodymyrivka, though if one looks at the map, there is fighting on almost every axis as their forces look to cut off the town. One Ukrainian officer operating there claims Russian divers are even attempting to penetrate into the Ukrainian rear via small rivers. Lastly, released footage reportedly shows Russian forces raising a flag in Temirivka, though as that soldier told Luke Harding at The Guardian I mentioned yesterday, just because a flag is raised doesn't necessarily mean it's firmly under Russian control. In fact, the Ukrainians seem to suggest that they used those flag raising as a means of zeroing in on Russian positions and killing the soldiers who've broken cover to do so. Before I turn to some updates on the naval theatre, a couple of days ago I mentioned that Musk's Starlink reportedly suffered an outage impacting many soldiers on the front line for 153 minutes. In a related story, Reuters are reporting Musk ordered the deactivation of Starlink during the counteroffensive in the fall of 2022. According to 3 individuals familiar with the matter, Musk instructed a senior SpaceX engineer to shut down coverage in the area near Berislav, where Ukrainian forces were attempting to encircle Russian troops. The move reportedly caused frontline units to lose connectivity, disabled drones, and disrupted artillery coordination. One Ukrainian military source claimed the outage directly contributed to the failure of that encirclement operation. As we know, Ukrainian forces later liberated Kherson and other settlements on the west bank of the Dnipro in November 22. But the immediate impact of the blackout raised alarm among military officials in both Kyiv and Washington. This is a fascinating story, one not known at the time. We can only speculate as to Musk's motivations if true. But given how precarious the situation was for the Russians on multiple fronts around that time, anything which impeded action should be studied very closely. Staying with soldiers, Zelensky signed a bill without much fanfare, allowing Ukrainian citizens over the age of 60 to voluntarily enlist in the military during martial law. Journalists spotted this on Parliament's website. The measure enables older volunteers to serve in non-combat and specialised roles, signing a 1-year contract for service if they pass a medical commission and are approved by a unit commander. Each new recruit undergoes a 2-month probationary period. If deemed unfit, the contract may be terminated early. It doesn't establish a maximum age limit for service, but all contracts will be voided automatically once martial law ends. On that very subject, the Kyiv Independent have published a fascinating long read into the subject of soldier demobilization, called Why Ukraine Can't Afford to Demobilize Its Soldiers. When Zelensky was asked recently when Ukrainian soldiers fighting since the first days of the invasion would be coming home, he replied, when we defeat the enemy. That brought renewed attention to the sensitive question of whether soldiers should be discharged from service while the war is ongoing. As the Kyiv Indie reports, the challenge is less a question of legislation and more one of recruiting enough to relieve those who've been on continuous duty. In short, Ukraine is not mobilising enough troops each month to let soldiers demobilise, leaving families wondering when they will be reunited. In May, Zelensky said Ukraine is currently mobilising around 25 to 27,000 troops per month, while Russia mobilises nearly twice that. The piece quotes several soldiers on this question, including a Dmytro in the 63rd Separate Mechanised Brigade, enlisted at the start of the invasion and on duty for over 3 years, with no path, barring desertion, of course, to leave the army. The lack of clear terms of service is a serious problem, he says, as it's taking a toll on soldiers' mental health. At the same time, I honestly do not know how this could be addressed under current conditions. But if nothing changes, it will eventually hurt the army. A clause allowing soldiers to be discharged after 3 years of service was initially included in the 2024 mobilisation bill. However, it was removed ahead of the second reading at the request of Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi. Under martial law, Ukrainian soldiers can be discharged only under a narrow set of conditions, such as serious health issues, the need to raise a child, or caring for close relatives with a severe illness or disability. Volunteers aged 18 to 24 who aren't subject to conscription can be discharged after 1 year of service if they have signed Contract 1824. That was the initiative by the Defence Ministry to encourage more young people to join up. But in most other cases, service members are required to remain on duty, entitled to 30 days of basic annual leave. However, even that leave can be denied if there are no available replacements. This is, of course, a common problem in war. Throughout history, many soldiers enlisted with the expectation of short campaigns, only to find themselves locked into years of continuous service as wars dragged on. In World War I, most famously, millions volunteered in 1914, believing it would all be over by Christmas. More recently, American soldiers in Vietnam often served one-year tours, but as the conflict escalated, found themselves redeployed or pressured to extend their time in uniform. In the Soviet-Afghan War, conscripts were conscripted, told that they would stabilise a friendly regime quickly, yet the conflict turned into, as we all know, a guerrilla war. Even earlier, I've read accounts from the American Civil War, when soldiers from both sides, having initially only signed up to fight for a year or so, were compelled to stay on until the end, although many, interestingly, were fairly content to do so because they didn't wish to abandon their units and comrades, but that was not a universal feeling. It really depended on when and where you were serving. Anyway, an important subject, we'll link to that piece in the episode description. Let's briefly turn to naval operations next. We haven't seen one of these in a while. Ukrainian special forces reportedly destroyed Russian weaponry during a combat operation on the Tendra Split, an island off the coast of the Black Sea near occupied Kherson. This is coming from Ukraine's military intelligence agency. They say the operation required a daring landing, though claim they suffered no casualties. Some video has been released with an operative saying Ukrainians are returning and taking back what is theirs. It's not clear whether they stayed or not. Previously, there was a raid on that settlement by the Ukrainians in August, destroying armoured vehicles, electronic warfare systems and fortifications. Now, footage has also been released for the first time of Ukraine's first deployment of FPV drones on the high seas, captured back in September during an operation off the coast of Crimea. Ukraine's Raven group deployed drones launched from boats in open waters to target Russian forces entrenched on a gas production platform. If you missed it yesterday, we continued our deep dive, pun intended this time, on the Ukrainian Navy, with Dom interviewing a recruiter for the Marines. Chatham House has also published a report this week into Russia's Black Sea strategy and their intentions to reinforce their presence with robotic systems, warships and additional aircraft. I'll link to that too. Now, you may have seen there was a very large 8.8 earthquake this morning that triggered a tsunami, impacting the Russian Far East and prompting evacuations in Japan and Hawaii. The regional emergency situations minister for Russia said it was one of the strongest tsunamis in decades, though I should stress there's no sign of any significant damage. Lastly, just a couple of very brief tech-related stories. Details have been released of France's biggest defence hack in history, where codes for combat systems and software for nuclear weapons were reportedly stolen. The attack targeted the French defence company Naval Group, which produces submarines and warships. Hackers accessed classified data, which they say also includes data on the combat control systems of US Navy submarines and frigates. We don't know anything more about who's responsible, but many are understandably speculating Russian involvement given Moscow's hybrid warfare on the continent. Lastly, the damage caused by that hack on Russia's largest airline, Aeroflot, also continues, with them being obliged to cancel flights for a second consecutive day after that pro-Ukrainian hacker group claimed responsibility. The airline cancelled 22 flights departing from Moscow's airport and 131 incoming flights, Interfax said. There have also been cyber attacks impacting Russian pharmacies, which Hamish will cover in a moment. But first of all, I just wanted to ask him about these renewed tank attacks we're seeing in Seversk. Hamish, welcome back. Without Dom, you're our resident tankie. As I say, Russian and Ukrainian armoured attacks have been reported recently, a rarer sight. It seems from footage that the Russian ones are fitted with anti-drone structures. Does that then negate the impact of drones? What were your reactions on watching some of that footage?
Thanks very much for having me, Francis, and hello to everybody. First of all, a bit of an apology. If we get drowned out by helicopters, I might have said before, I live on the edge of Salisbury Plain, which is the biggest military training area in this country. Interesting, where all the Ukrainians are trained on Op Interflex. But there must be a massive exercise going on at the moment because my house keeps getting buzzed by Wildcats, Chinooks, and Apache helicopters. But onto the tank issue, which is fascinating because I've probably mentioned in the past, I'm currently writing a book on tanks. I've just finished the chapter on the Battle of Kursk 1943. At the very moment, I'm writing about the Normandy landings, the battle between the Shermans and the Tigers, and the Panthers. And what was really interesting about this particular piece of footage is that actually the ground doesn't look dissimilar to the bocage. The bocage is the area in northern France where, after the initial Normandy landings, the Allies had to fight the Germans to try and break through. Because the countryside in this part of Ukraine and further east is sort of ideal tank country. So you would have thought we would see a lot more tank action. But I think the Ukrainians claim that they've killed 10,000 Russian tanks. Other figures put it more, but 5,000 to 6,000. But whatever happens, that is a heck of a lot. When you think the British Army has about 148 tanks at the moment, I'll just come back to that in a minute. It seems clear from the reporting that we're getting out of Russia that actually Russian soldiers have rather lost faith in tanks because, of those that have been destroyed, the majority have been by drones. Hence, Francis, that we're seeing all these counter-drone type capability. And last year we were talking about the turtle tanks, and we've seen others developed. You might have heard Dom and I speaking about Hobart's funnies. This is in the Second World War. General Sir Percy Hobart, another Royal Tank Regiment officer, designed all these tanks for various applications. They had a flamethrower tank, a flail tank that blew up mines as it went forward, tanks that could swim. So what you have to do on the battlefield is try and find a way to survive and operate. And that's why we're seeing these incredible vehicle tanks with massive cages on them. And actually in this video, it looks like a small building moving. But we discussed before, the capability of a tank is a balance between firepower, protection and mobility. And if you can get that balance right, the tank is still a very viable fighting platform on the battlefield, as it has been for the last 117 years. And I think this video really illustrates a whole host of things. So for those people who haven't seen it, it's a Ukrainian tank, probably a T-72. We don't think it's one of the Western tanks, a Leopard 2 or a Challenger 2 or an Abrams, but it might well be. The first thing you notice, it's moving around on its own. You would have heard us tankies talking about you never operate tanks in isolation. That's not how we learn to do it, because you want mutual support and protection as you move around. But this Ukrainian tank is operating on its own. My take from that is actually its mutual support, or we call it as protection, is being provided by something else, probably a whole host of drones. And the fact that it is, as I mentioned, the bocage, or lots of hedges in northern France, makes it very difficult to see what's on the other side of the hedge, which is why so many Allied tanks were lost in 1944. But actually, the way that tank warfare is being conducted now is enhancement with drones. So each tank will have a drone tethered to it. And although one can't see it on the video, it's highly likely that this Ukrainian tank that's maneuvering has a couple of drones that are actually looking for targets. And this massive Russian sort of turtle tank is a very easy target. And then you see it move around a hedgerow and fire at about 100 meters. Now, that is incredibly close. I mean, you generally, on the firepower piece of your tank, you want to utilize its capability. Challenger 2 can knock out a Russian tank at nearly 3 kilometers. So why on earth would you get to 100 meters range? And of course, that Russian tank might be protected against drones, but it's not protected against 125 millimeter solid tungsten dart that these tanks are firing, and hugely effective in there. I think one of the challenges that the Russians have had as well is training. I think I described before, when I was commanding officer of the 1st Royal Tank Regiment, it took about a year to train the regiment to be able to do sort of maneuver type operations, which is why we're not seeing it. So when looking at the protection side, the current protection for drones on tanks is these massive cages and almost corrugated iron, which might protect it against drones, but makes it an easy target for everything else. Lots of people ask me, are we learning the lessons of what is happening in Ukraine? And I mentioned before that we're hoping to get the army, the land lessons learned team onto Ukraine the latest at some stage, once we've got all the clearances through. So actually you can hear from the horse's mouth what we are learning from Ukraine and how we are adapting our military capability, our tactics to reflect the current battle. I have to be very careful not to give away any confidentialities, but certainly speaking to people who are on the Challenger 3 team at the moment. So Challenger 3 is the next generation British tank that's been produced, imaginatively 1, 2, 3, and I spent 25 years on 1 and 2, so I was rather hoping they'd call it something else. But actually discussing the detail, I think they got it right. And the one sort of back to the original question, Francis, I'm sort of my usual roundabout way trying to get to it is the drone thing. If you have a protection that makes you susceptible to other things, then it's not really a protection. I posted a video the other day about the Turks have just launched a new, well, they're calling it a tank. It's a sort of laser tank, which is actually designed not to destroy other tanks per se, but actually drones, ability to fire multiple lasers. And that really is the sort of answer. And if Challenger 3 had something similar, and it is open source information that the Defence Science Laboratory at Porton Down are working on a defensive aid suite for drones where you can put it on an armoured vehicle like a tank. It'll fire multiple, if not thousands of lasers to take out thousands of drones. And when you couple that with what we call ECM, electronic countermeasures, in other words, the ability to destroy the electronic link the drone has to its controlling station, then you can provide a really effective defensive aid suite, but without making the tank more vulnerable. And that's the sort of way that we're going. So I think that is really, really positive. So, a really long answer to your question, France. I hope I've covered it in enough detail.
Plenty of detail, Hamish. Thank you very, very much for your reflections on that. Now, there was another story that I was referencing a moment ago, and that, of course, is the cyber attacks on Russia recently. And whilst, of course, they're impacting some groups far more than others, we mustn't over-egg this. I know that you've got some reflections on the significance of them.
Absolutely. And I hope people will get the sort of juxtaposition from moving from tanks to cyber. But this is the reality of the modern battlefield. Some people might have seen the National Cyber Security Centre in the UK, which is part of GCHQ, produced a report really warning everybody that the Russians are really trying to attack us from a cyber perspective. And anybody who uses Marks and Spencer's regularly or the Co-op will know that the issues that they've had, and according to the Cyber Security Centre, this is all Russian. The Ukrainians have really shown that they understand what in the Second World War was called the Special Operations Executive. This is working behind the enemy lines physically, but also electronically. Do all you can, what we call the deep battle, to try and affect things. Because we see on the close battle, as we call, or the tactical battle, Ukraine is still unbalanced. Russia has more tanks, more ammunition, etc., etc. So how do you gain advantage? You gain advantage by trying to control the deep battle, doing the unexpected. And anybody who is interested more in this, the Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu is fantastic about the sort of indirect approach and doing things that are not necessarily head on. And that's really where cyber comes in. And Francis, you mentioned in the beginning to this, the fact that the Aeroflot has been hit with a cyber attack. There seem to be 2 Ukrainian cyber groups who are doing incredible work. Now, the attack on Aeroflot is sort of brilliant. Also linked into the pharmacies. We understand the main pharmacy network in the Moscow area, 900 pharmacies have been hacked. So I think what has been really clever with this is that it's been focused actually at the movers and shakers. It's, without wanting to sound too trite, it is people in Moscow and St. Petersburg who actually control and run the country and have any influence at all outside the Kremlin. So to focus on them is probably the right thing to do, because they don't seem to be that concerned that 1 million soldiers have been killed or injured on the front line. But when their day-to-day life is starting to be impacted, then absolutely. I mean, the Russians seem to manage to control social media incredibly well, but they can't control pharmacies not being able to open. They can't control Aeroflot not being able to fly because it's been electronically attacked. my sort of final piece on this, and we've talked many times about Operation Spider's Web, the really deep battle, again enabled by electronics. And it also shows that there are quite a lot of people in Russia who are prepared to support and help these things, as there was in Europe when the Special Operation Executive was working. So I think this sort of comprehensive approach is exactly what the Ukrainians should be doing. And let's hope, and I know you covered it yesterday, with Trump going from his 50 days down to 10 days before the sanctions and tariffs hits, although he did say on his way back to the States and Air Force One, he wasn't absolutely convinced it was going to make a difference. But when you put all this together, hopefully it will make a difference. And what we all want is a just peace for Ukraine as soon as possible. Over.
For today's pre-recorded interview, many of you will remember the Oscar and BAFTA-winning film 20 Days in Mariupol, filmed amid the harrowing siege of that city in 2022. Its director, Mstyslav Chernov, has a new film coming out this February, August 1st, in the UK. It's called 2,000 Metres to Andriivka and follows a platoon through the 2-kilometre stretch of forest, liberating that strategic village from Russian forces. Adélie sat down with him to chat about the project.
Thank you very much for joining me, Mstislav. Can you tell me how, after your first film, which was in Mariupol at the very beginning of the invasion, how did you decide to embed with that unit, and how did you decide to zoom in on such a important but also specific zone in the conflict with such a specific goal?
This was quite a special time in the year, that summer of 2023. We were campaigning, we were screening 20 days in Mariupol, in US, in Europe, in UK. And it was just the experience of going from red carpets at the screenings to Ukrainian front lines, that transition from one world to another world, that transition from quite abstract conversations about numbers of casualties, about all land that was gained during the counteroffensive. All the headlines of the world were filled with these numbers and names. And just coming to those guys, seeing the soldiers on the front line, seeing various specific events that were unfolding, cities that were liberated, and seeing how much they paid with their lives for each meter of that land inspired me to try to tell that story, because I felt such a disconnect between two worlds. I still feel it, of course, and for a good reason. War is unnatural and terrible, and it shouldn't be happening. So the wish to bring closer the experience of the Ukrainian soldier who is currently at the front line of Europe to European audiences, to US audiences, to UK audiences, was what inspired the film. And then I've started following several platoons, and then we've met with our protagonists, Fedya and his team. And at the time they were recovering from the battle they went through, where they lost their friend, and they were watching through the body cam footage that they recorded. Part of that battlefield footage is in the film too. And just seeing their experiences, their reactions, seeing that tiny strip of forest on the map, Andriivka, that tiny village in the end of it, just brought me to a conclusion that this could be a symbol of what all Ukrainian soldiers are going through at that moment. And that seemed to be a very important story to tell.
And what's really striking about this stretch of land is that it's 2,000 meters, so 2 kilometers. As you say in the film, you can run it in 10 minutes. The film itself is almost 2 hours long. And you say that in the film. How much time did it take them to get to Andriivka? Several months, I think?
Around 3 months, yes. The entire operation
3 months.
was like,
yeah, 3 months. And the sense of distance, it really creates a very physical measurement, and that's how the film is constructed. But what really struck me is that as you and the soldiers progress through these 2,000 meters, the tone of the film really changes and goes from something where at the beginning, the end in sight and the key to victory is Andriivka. By the end of it, it's actually very melancholic, because there's the layer of the footage recording the battles. And then on top of it, there's your narration that tracks that most of the soldiers you're speaking with have actually died, if not during that battle in the following months. What did you have in mind when you started out, and how did that new layer come onto it, and how did it change your filmmaking process?
I think what you just said is quite literary. That's how we applied this knowledge that was coming to us while we were editing. The sad news of the death of some of our protagonists came to us, and we went to their funerals, we spoke to their families, and we experienced their sadness. And of course, I wanted that a memory of them, of that sadness and that honor that those who remain alive gave to those who have fallen, to remain in the film. So the beginning of our editing, the beginning of the film, when we still didn't know that they were going to die in other battles, it is hopeful. But then as we gain that knowledge, that also influences our story. So yeah, I think the arc of the film represents pretty well what we lived through that year that we were editing, and we were trying to tell that story. And you can see that by the end of the film, I, as a narrator, become quite melancholic and weary of war. But at the same time, I keep admiring the strength and the courage of each of those men. And it was just about keeping the right balance, because I know, however desperate I am, until those men, until Fedya and his team are there at that front line, my hometown, Kyiv, and my region will not be occupied. They are right now. I've seen them a couple of weeks ago in Ukraine. They are right now in Kharkiv region, my home region. And if they fall, my city is occupied. So, eternally grateful to them for my home still existing.
Yeah, and there's almost that disconnect between your narrative voice and the soldiers at one point, when one of the soldier who we learn later dies after the film, after the moment where you're shooting, says, the best thing about war, I think, is that you can start from scratch. To me, that was very striking how powerfully optimistic and determined the soldiers were.
Yes, that's why Ukraine hasn't fallen. That's exactly the reason. And that's why I think it's such an important part of the film, that seeing the motivation of those men who all signed up for this voluntarily and went to take weapons in their hands and protect their homes. Just seeing their motivation, you understand why, even if all the international support fails, if everyone forgets about Ukraine and turns their back to Ukraine, Ukraine will still survive as a nation, as a country, because of men like Fedya and his platoon and his brigade. And that's what I wanted to show, that this fight, it is very important political as well, but it all comes down to these men fighting for what they believe on the ground that is very, very real. And that is where we all were children growing up. And now we see that ground in those cities destroyed.
By the time you were finishing editing the film and it was coming together, did you feel that the film had become a bit of a memorial?
Oh, yes. And also, it even ends in some way with a memorial service. Well, what's special about that ending, about that memorial service, that is not just memorial. It's not a place or a moment where you go and then you just say, well, those people are dead. When you listen to what these men are saying when they commemorate their fallen friends, they are with us, so that they are among them. It's not that they have fallen and were gone. They're still there. So that what makes that memorial very special, that nothing is lost. And as long as their names live, they live for their families and for their friends. And the film starts with a Hemingway's quote about importance of names, and only names mattered in the end. And that's a 100-year-old quote.
I thought about that because I actually did not really understand the quote when the film opened, and by the end of it, I got it So what you say about the name Andriivka, the place doesn't really exist. It's just rubble and ruin. No one is living there. Will it ever come back to life again? And these people have died, but their names remain. One thing that I think the film really embodies is all the different hats that you have. You're a journalist covering the battle, but you're also at the end of the day an individual trying to survive. Can you talk to me about that intersection and when one takes over from the other?
I think my main hat would be my desire to give the audience an understanding of how it is to be there at that front line and not just observe, but to live at least for a couple hours, to walk in the cinema or turn on the computer and live through that experience. So everything I do while we're editing or while I'm there with the soldiers, everything I do is serving that purpose to bring the audience in soldiers' experience. And to do that right, to do that adequately, you can't really do that through distance. You have to be there with them. However scary it is, however dangerous it is, the only way to do it right is to be with them. And so then when I am speaking about my own experience, when I'm telling this story from my own perspective, as I do through the voiceover, then my experience is similar to their experience. And I can sometimes even talk for them. Although, of course, their voices are the most important voices in the film. So it would be ethically wrong to speak about someone else's pain, and it would be ethically wrong to go as deep in that pain as we do in our attempts to portray their horrifying reality of war if we did not go through that experience ourselves. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Can you talk to me more about the aesthetic aspect of the film? Because the film mixes body cam footage, which is very raw. As the battles unfold, you run around. It's not always what we call clean footage, but then we also have some very beautiful shots of either the soldiers close up when you're in a dugout, or overhead shots of a cemetery or of Ukraine and all the destruction. What sort of inspirations in terms of the depictions of war did you bring into the making of this film?
Yeah, the challenge is to portray the war as realistic as possible without sanitizing it, because that's the last thing we want to do to make war beautiful and make it acceptable. The war is unacceptable. So we have to do everything in our power to portray it as close to reality as possible. At the same time, of course, we do have to make sure that we respect the audience, we respect men whose stories we're telling. And so this balancing on edge of horror and beauty, balancing on the edge of thrill and rejection of the nature of war, and those paradoxes, they are in the core of the film. And that's why sometimes one scene will bring you down to the most bloody and horrifying experience. And the next scene, it has its purpose to give you some time to reflect on what you just seen, on the loss that happened on a battlefield. So we zoom out and we give that time to the audience and we give that space. And here I have to give a shout to Michelle Meissner, amazing editor that was with me on 20 Days in Mariupol. And here too, in this film, on 2000 Meters to Andriivka, she found that right rhythm and right balance between horror and beauty, and was able to tell that story and without letting the audience turn away.
The moments of beauty, and especially when you're filming the soldiers up close in moments where things are slightly more calm, is also what creates connection to them. Like Shava, I think?
Shava, yes, yeah. It's interesting that the discovery that we made during editing of body cam footage is that we have expected that perspective that brings you into literally the eyes of the soldier will be the most relatable, because it is literally someone else's experience and you are in their eyes. But it wasn't. And without moments of intimate connection with people in those trenches and foxholes and dugouts where you just sit and talk, and you don't talk about big ideas or patriotic visions. You talk about families and university and cigarettes and what his wife said and what he wants when he comes back home, and all sorts of smaller things that makes us human, that not small things, but the main things that make us human. Those moments have created connection of the audience with the body cam footage that came after them. So when we were editing, that's what we were trying to balance in a film. The moments of intimate connection with each one of them, and then showing their experiences through the body cam footage.
The conversation about Shav's wife is absolutely lovely. Have you ever met her?
Yes, we met his family. He has an amazing, lovely family, and all other families of all other soldiers who you see in the film, they came to the screening of the film in Kyiv, and they saw their loved ones for the first time on screen, and they heard the entire audience, hundreds of people, crying and gasping and commemorating the lives of their loved ones. And that was a heartbreaking moment, but it was an important moment, because later Sheva's wife came to us and she said, now I can show his grandson who his grandfather was. And that's why this film exists. We want them to not be forgotten.
Going back to the body cam footage, that's a depiction of war that some people will be very used to through video games. Obviously, this is very much not a video games. Was that something you had in mind when you were making the film and editing the film as well, that you didn't want people to think this was what they were playing on a computer?
No, that reference, of course, was there in our minds, but not because something we wanted to achieve. The body cam footage itself is quite a common medium right now. It is recorded for the battlefield purposes. It is something that we see in YouTube and in Telegram channels and Instagram quite frequently, just in pieces, not as a film. So it is a medium that a lot of people already got used to. Adding the fact that it sometimes does look like a video game if you distancing yourself from the fact that it is a reality. So all that put together brought us to a challenge of how do we make sure it doesn't feel like a video game? How do we make sure that at each moment the audience remembers that they are watching something that is real and something that has an impact not only on the battlefield, but far beyond it, on families, on the society, and on the world. And I remember that sometimes people would come to me after the screening of the film and say, oh, in the beginning, I felt like it's just a video game. But then I realized it was all real, and it hit me even harder. And so, well, if that's the case, then yeah, that's the power of medium of documentary. We discover new forms of documentary. We try to push the medium forward, and then we bring the audience where they haven't been yet.
In terms of audience reaction, it's very touching to hear the families' reactions to seeing their loved ones on screen, especially after their death. What sort of reactions have you seen or are you hoping to see between different type of audiences? Ukrainian people in Ukraine, Ukrainian people outside of Ukraine, foreigners who have no relation to Ukraine at all. Do you have any hopes or expectations or disappointments so far?
Having expectations on the impact of the film you're making inevitably brings you to disappointment. And it's not the experience of 20 Days, which was a very successful film and millions of people saw it and it made its impact on international level and made its impact in Ukraine. But nevertheless, we see the war going on and things becoming even worse and more cities being destroyed. So if you zoom out and you think about the impact of this work, then you inevitably end up disappointed. So I don't set those goals, really. But I do observe the reactions of the audiences. And of course, my goal is to ask questions and make sure that people have context when they watch film, then they have more context that they have on what's really happening, right? But I remember the reaction of the soldiers, specifically the soldiers who are in the film, but also soldiers who are their friends and from their brigade, from other brigades. And what's interesting is I remember them walking out of a cinema, and one of the screenings was in a cinema where it's a multiplex cinema. So you have other films and all of them are amazing. So it was quite interesting to observe the soldiers that came out from that experience of 2,000 meters to Andriivka colliding with the audience of fiction films that are playing there. And what they told us, that they wish these people who went to see these fiction films instead went to see 2,000 meters to Andriivka. So they feel closer to soldiers who are defending them. And I realized that that's what probably was motivating me in making this film too, the theme of distance. So shortening the distance between that part of Ukrainian society, a small part, but it's still a significant part of Ukrainian society that is distancing themselves from war. The European society that is mostly distancing themselves from war too. So bringing these audiences closer to that literal front line of Europe, that is an imminent danger for democracy, for the life we all had for years. And I remember when the young people in Karlovy Vary and Czech Republic, they walk out from the cinema, and I can see that they realize that these men they've seen on the screen are the same men that they are, that they could be in their place. That's shortening the distance. So I think it does its job so far. And the only way you can do it is now through cinema, because journalism is losing trust because of the people who actively undermine truth. And so cinema takes on that task of bringing people closer to real events that are happening in the world.
In terms of the journalism, how did you prepare for shooting with the platoon? Did you have to go through any sort of preparations, both physically, militarily, but also from like a journalistic perspective?
No military preparation, of course, but you do have to know the situation on the ground. You have to be aware of where the front line is and what's the situation. Medical training, of course, the most important part of that survival that is happening on the battlefield is a person next to you. I was not alone. I was with a co-producer and second camera, Alex Babenko, and having someone who you trust with your life on the battlefield is absolutely essential for survival. So you are afraid for his life more than for your own, but you know that he is afraid for your life more than for his own. That is mutual survival, and that's how you prepare. You go in not alone. You have to be among people you trust. You have to be among friends. Otherwise, there is just no way to survive.
So this film is coming out. Do you have any other films in the making? Any projects that you can talk about at this stage?
Can't really talk about the details of. I have several projects going on, some of them fiction, some of them documentary. My dream is to make a film about the end of this war. Whether I succeed or not, that's not up to me, but that is my hope. Until then, I'll be making films because there are so many perspectives. The war is such a complex topic, and this particular war is so personal that just to be able to show each aspect of it would take a lot of films. And I'm happy I'm not working alone. There are so many other talented documentary Ukrainian filmmakers who do that.
You said cinema is more powerful in telling the truth nowadays, especially because people don't really trust journalism. And obviously the work that you do is at the intersection of cinema and journalism. Way down the line, in a very long time when the war is over, could you see yourself, and do you think it would be relevant, telling the story of Ukraine and of this war, but through fiction?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah. Obviously, the time has to pass. We need time to reflect on what happened and how it ended. But I will definitely be doing that.
At the end of the film, when we can see the soldier putting up the Ukrainian flag in Andriivka, since that film is both very melancholic and we can hear a lot of your doubts, did you have a sense, and do you have a sense now, that this is very far away, or that this victory and this Ukrainian flag flying on the ruins is possible, is within reach?
It is, of course, within reach. Look what happened to Syria. No one has expected that. Everyone lost hope that that story will come to conclusion, right? And then Bashar Assad's regime will fall. And yet, in the moment when nobody has expected it, it happened. So hope is not something impossible. And the end of war is always there. But it's good to remember that nothing is given for granted. The liberty, the independence, the identity of nation, even just your own life when you're attacked and fighting for your survival, nothing is given to you. Everything has to be fought for. And until you remember that, I think you'll be okay. It will be sad. It will seem impossible to move forward. And we all been in the places where it seems that everything's lost. But the core idea behind 2,000 meters to Andriivka and what I learned through these years is that no one can survive alone. And when there is someone next to you standing, that's when you're the strongest. And you can rely on your community. You can rely on your family to live through these horrible times.
What does justice look like to you?
Justice is a very specific system that exists to punish those who committed crimes. So there is a very specific image of justice for Ukraine and for the modern world. Those people who have committed crimes, whether they're big crimes against humanity or crimes on a ground level, whether that's murder or stealing or rape or stealing children and re-educating them or torturing civilians, all those things are crimes. And justice is real only when it punishes those who committed those crimes. So justice is names of criminals. Justice is punishment for those criminals. And justice is public knowledge about that punishment.
Let's turn to our final thoughts now, something a bit lighter. I was with colleagues at Waterloo Station this morning promoting the centenary of Telegraph Puzzles. We were the first newspaper in Britain to have a daily crossword, believe it or not, with interesting connections to the Second World War. First, the better-known tale. In 1942, MI6 collaborated with the Telegraph to identify potential codebreakers for Bletchley Park. We hosted a public crossword competition, challenging readers to complete a cryptic puzzle in under 12 minutes. Unbeknownst to participants, the fastest solvers were approached by government officials and invited to take part in the war effort. Some of them went on to play key roles in decrypting German communications. The second lesser-known tale was in 1944, just before the Allied invasion of Normandy, when British intelligence was alarmed, understandably so, to find several key D-Day code names, such as Overlord and Neptune, appearing as answers in the Telegraph's crossword puzzles. Fearing a security breach, MI5 interrogated our poor crossword compiler, a schoolteacher who had often involved students in generating clues. After investigation, it appeared that the overlaps were picked up innocently by children overhearing military chatter among local soldiers. Now, that poor incident caused considerable panic within the highest levels of military planning. Pretty extraordinary story. And in the show notes, I'll link to our special Centenary Puzzles page where you can attempt our first ever crossword from 1925. I had a stab this morning. The first clue is author of Childe Harold, which I leapt on because it's the poem that describes, surprise, surprise, the generational disillusionment after the Napoleonic Wars. Hemingway didn't come up with that idea of the lost generation. Lord Byron did, of course. Anyway, Hamish, where do you want to leave listeners?
Yeah, thank you very much, Francis. What I'd like to say and point people in the direction today, the French government announced that from the autumn, it will be mandatory for all 16 to 25-year-olds to attend a military briefing day where they will be briefed on the military and they'll be briefed on good citizenship. And actually, they will also be encouraged to join the reserve. The French want to increase their reserve by, I can't remember the exact figures, but up to 100 to 200,000. But it just seemed to me a really good way to attack, in inverted commas, a really, really tricky issue. Because I think a lot of our youngsters who haven't had family in the military, it's very different 10, 20 years ago when most of our sort of grandparents had fought in the Second World War or even Korea, to understand what military service is all about and why it's required. And if you're really against getting involved in the military, then getting involved in other civil projects, the sort of things that you can do. And I don't often praise the French, despite, of course, having some French DNA in me. But I thought this is a really good idea and certainly something that we should consider that might actually put the military back in the spotlight as we should do. And slightly in that vein, I wrote a piece over the weekend with Richard Williams, who used to be commanding officer of 22 SAS, on the whole sort of balance between ourselves and the Americans about how we treat our military. And in the US, I've had it many times myself. If you're in the military, you can go into business class lounges and you board the aeroplane first, and everybody thanks you for your service. Now, it's slightly different in this country, but generally most people are pretty supportive. I think it's worth, at these particular times, worth considering the way that we can increase the capability and support to our military. Let's hope we never have to use them any more than we do at the moment. But I think better education of the general population is probably a good thing. Thank you.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nichols and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, We're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.